Hyde Park, New York, 1943. A widow pushed through Secret Service and grabbed Franklin Roosevelt's wheelchair. Everyone froze. What she said next made the president cancel his entire day and start a program that saved thousands. It was late October. The leaves on the Roosevelt estate had turned gold and crimson. The war in Europe was grinding through its fourth year. Every day, mothers opened telegrams with shaking hands. Every week, more names were added to church memorial boards. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at 61, had returned to Hyde Park for a rare weekend away from Washington. The weight of leading a nation at war had carved deep lines into his face. He sat in his wheelchair on the south lawn, a blanket across his paralyzed legs. Eleanor had gone inside. Secret Service agents stood at a respectful distance. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. Then the shouting started. "Mr. President! Mr. President!" The voice cut through the autumn air like broken glass. Desperate, raw, angry, the Secret Service agents moved immediately, forming a protective barrier. But the woman was fast. She'd somehow gotten past the outer perimeter, past the checkpoints, driven by something stronger than security protocols. She was running across the lawn, her worn coat flapping behind her, her face twisted with grief and fury. "I need to talk to you. You have to listen to me." She was maybe 35 years old, thin to the point of gaunt, dark hair pulled back in a hasty bun. Her shoes were scuffed. Her stockings had runs. She looked like she'd been crying for weeks. Two agents grabbed her arms before she reached Roosevelt. She struggled, not with violence, but with the frantic energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Let me go! He needs to hear this! He needs to know what he's done!" Roosevelt raised his hand slowly. "Wait." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded a nation through depression and war. The agents hesitated. "Let her speak." "Sir, protocol," one agent began. "I said let her speak." Roosevelt's jaw was set. He wheeled himself slightly forward, his powerful arms moving the chair with practiced ease despite his useless legs. "What's your name?" The woman stopped struggling. The agents loosened their grip but didn't let go. She was breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Donnelly, and you killed my husband." Silence fell across the lawn like snow. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Roosevelt didn't flinch. He'd heard angry words before, accusations, blame. Leading a nation at war meant carrying the weight of every death. But something in this woman's voice made him listen differently. This wasn't political rage. This was personal grief, raw and bleeding. "Tell me about him," Roosevelt said quietly. Margaret blinked. She'd expected to be dragged away, expected dismissal, security, silence. Not this. "What? Your husband. Tell me about him." Roosevelt gestured to the agents. "Let her go. She's not going to hurt me." They released her reluctantly, hovering close. Roosevelt wheeled himself closer until he was just a few feet from her. "What was his name?" "James," her voice cracked. "James Patrick Donnelly. He was 28 years old. We had two little boys, Tommy's 6, Michael just turned 4. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "He died at Sicily, July. They sent me a telegram. Regret to inform you. That's all. Just regret to inform you." Roosevelt's hands tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" The word came out like a slap. "You're sorry? Do you know what sorry gets me, Mr. President? Do you know what sorry buys at the grocery store?" Her voice was rising again, years of held-back rage finally breaking free. "I work double shifts at the munitions factory, 14 hours a day. My boys barely see me. And we're still behind on rent. The landlord doesn't care that my husband died for his country. He wants his money. Sorry doesn't feed my children." What Roosevelt said next stunned everyone on that lawn. "You're right." His voice was steady but thick with something deeper. "You're absolutely right, and I need to know more. Will you come inside? Please? I want to hear everything." The senior Secret Service agent stepped forward. "Mr. President, we haven't vetted—" "Then vet her while we talk." Roosevelt's tone left no room for argument. He looked at Margaret, his blue eyes direct and unflinching. "I'm asking, will you come inside and talk to me? Not as the president, as someone who needs to understand what we're failing to do." Margaret stood there, shaking. This wasn't what she'd planned. She'd come here to scream, to make him see, to hurt him the way she was hurting. But this man in the wheelchair, this president who'd sent her husband to die, was looking at her like she mattered. Like her pain mattered. "Yes," she whispered. Roosevelt's private study at Hyde Park was nothing like the Oval Office. It was smaller, more personal, lined with books he'd collected since childhood. A fire crackled in the fireplace. Eleanor had joined them, sitting quietly in a chair by the window, her intelligent eyes taking everything in. She'd insisted on being there, not as First Lady, but as a witness to whatever truth was about to be told. Margaret sat on a sofa, a cup of tea she hadn't touched cooling on the table beside her. Roosevelt had wheeled himself close, genuinely close, not keeping the formal distance of power. He'd taken off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves. The President of the United States was listening to her like she was the most important person in the world. "James wanted to enlist right after Pearl Harbor," Margaret said, her voice steadier now in the warmth of the room. "I begged him not to. I knew what would happen. But he said it was his duty. He said if he didn't go, he couldn't look our boys in the eye when they grew up." She twisted her wedding ring, a thin gold band that caught the firelight. "He promised he'd come home. He promised." Roosevelt nodded slowly. He knew about promises. He knew about the gap between what you hope and what happens. Did the Army provide any support? After? Margaret's laugh was bitter. "They sent his last paycheck, $63, and they offered to ship his body home for burial, but I couldn't afford the funeral. So he's buried in a military cemetery in Sicily. I've never even seen his grave." She looked up, meeting Roosevelt's eyes. "Do you know what it's like to not be able to say goodbye? To not even know where your husband's body is?" Roosevelt's throat worked. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I know what it's like to lose the use of your body, to be trapped, to be helpless." He gestured at his legs. "Polio took these from me when I was 39. I was supposed to run for governor, supposed to have a future. Instead, I couldn't walk, couldn't stand. My mother wanted me to retire to Hyde Park and fade away quietly." Margaret frowned, confused by the shift. "I don't understand. What I'm saying is that I know what it feels like when the world doesn't care about your pain, when systems fail you, when you're left to figure it out alone." Roosevelt leaned forward. "And you're right to be angry. You're right to be here. Because you shouldn't be alone in this. Your husband gave everything, and we gave you a telegram and $63. That's not enough. That's not even close to enough." Eleanor spoke for the first time. "How are you managing? With the boys?" Margaret's composure cracked again. "I'm not. That's the truth. I'm not managing. My neighbor watches them while I work, but she's got her own family. Tommy's falling behind in school. Michael has nightmares every night. He asks when Daddy's coming home, and I don't know what to tell him anymore." She covered her face with her hands. "And I'm so tired. I'm so tired of being strong. I'm so tired of doing this alone." But something else was stirring in that study, something neither woman had expected. Roosevelt was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled together, his brilliant mind already working through problems and solutions. Then he reached over to his desk and pulled out a notepad. "Tell me what you need. Not what you think you deserve or what seems reasonable. Tell me what you actually need to take care of your boys and yourself." Margaret stared at him. "What? I'm asking, what would it take? Be specific." She opened her mouth, closed it. No one had ever asked her that. Not the Army, not the factory boss, not the landlord. No one. I need help with rent. I need someone to watch the boys so I don't have to work night shifts. I need to know that if something happens to me, they'll be taken care of. That James's death meant something. That his boys won't grow up in poverty because their father was a hero." Roosevelt was writing. Fast. His handwriting was terrible, years of practice signing documents at speed, making it nearly illegible, but he was getting it all down. "What else?" "Medical care. Tommy needs glasses. I can't afford them. And Michael needs to see a doctor about the nightmares, about the bedwetting. But I can't pay for that either." "What else?" "Education. I want them to go to college someday. James never got to, but he was smart. So smart. And our boys deserve a chance to become something better than—" She gestured at herself. "Better than this." Roosevelt kept writing. Eleanor had moved closer, looking over his shoulder. After several minutes, Roosevelt set down the pen and looked up. "Mrs. Donnelly, what you've described isn't just your problem, it's a national problem. There are thousands of widows like you, tens of thousands of children growing up without fathers because of this war. And you're right. We're failing them. We're failing you. So what are you going to do about it?" The question wasn't angry anymore. It was searching, almost hopeful. "I'm going to fix it." Roosevelt's voice had steel in it now, the same steel that had guided the nation through its darkest hours. "I'm going to create a system, a real system, not charity, not handouts, but a structure that takes care of the families of every man and woman who serves. Education benefits, housing assistance, medical care, job training. A promise that if you give your life for this country, your family won't be forgotten." Margaret's eyes widened. "You can do that?" "I'm the president," Roosevelt said with a slight smile. "I can do a lot of things. But more importantly, you made me see that I have to do this. That it's not enough to win the war if we abandon the people who paid for that victory." Eleanor nodded. "I'll work on it too. There are women's organizations, veteran groups. We can build support for this, make it more than just a program, make it a promise." 3 months later, Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress. Well, he didn't stand. He never did. But he spoke with a power that had nothing to do with his legs. The speech was about post-war planning, about what would come after victory. Buried in the middle, between paragraphs about economic recovery and international cooperation, was a proposal, a comprehensive support system for the families of fallen service members. Education, housing, medical care, job training. Everything Margaret Donnelly had asked for in that study at Hyde Park and more. He called it the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. History would remember it as the GI Bill. And though most of its provisions focused on returning veterans, Roosevelt made sure it included special protections and benefits for war widows and orphans. Margaret Donnelly was sitting in the gallery that day. Roosevelt had invited her personally. She held a handkerchief, twisting it in her hands as she listened to the president describe the very things she'd asked for. When he finished, when the applause died down, Roosevelt looked up at the gallery. Their eyes met across the chamber. He nodded once. She nodded back. A reporter caught up with her afterward. "Mrs. Donnelly, did you know the president was going to do this?" She thought for a moment. "I think he always knew he should. I just helped him see it was urgent. The bill passed in June 1944. By the time Roosevelt died less than a year later, the framework was in place. Over the next decade, it would transform millions of lives. Veterans went to college, bought homes, started businesses, and quietly, often unnoticed in the history books, war widows and their children received support that kept them from falling into poverty. Margaret Donnelly lived until 1989. Her sons both went to college on government scholarships established by the GI Bill extensions. Tommy became a teacher. Michael became a doctor specializing in childhood trauma. They never forgot their father. But they also never forgot that their lives were shaped by a moment when their grieving mother pushed past Secret Service and grabbed a wheelchair. In 1982, a historian interviewing Margaret asked her if she'd been scared that day at Hyde Park. She thought for a long time. No, I was beyond scared. I'd already lost everything. I had nothing left to be afraid of. And maybe that's what he heard in my voice. She smiled. He listened, really listened, not like a politician, like a human being trying to understand pain he'd never felt. And he was brave enough to admit he'd failed. There's a lesson in that autumn afternoon. Power can sign orders and move armies. But it takes courage to listen to the people those orders affect, to sit with their pain, to admit failure, to change course not because it's politically convenient but because it's human necessary. Roosevelt commanded the most powerful military in the world. But that day in Hyde Park, he wasn't a president. He was a man who understood what it meant to be broken. And maybe that's what gave him the wisdom to really hear Margaret Donnelly. Millions of families were kept whole because one widow refused to be silent, because one president had the humility to listen. In the end, changing the world doesn't always require grand strategies. Sometimes it requires one person brave enough to speak, and one person brave enough to hear. Subscribe for more untold human stories from America's past.